Wesley Carrington brought his hand down so hard across Imani's face that she spun into the marble countertop and cracked two ribs on the edge before she hit the floor. He didn't raise his voice. That was the part that always made it worse. He crouched down beside her while she was still trying to pull air into her lungs and said, very quietly, "You embarrassed me tonight." Then he stood, straightened his cuffs, picked up his coat from the chair where he'd dropped it, and walked to the elevator without looking back. The doors closed. The penthouse went silent except for the sound of Imani breathing in short, ragged pulls that felt like swallowing broken glass. She lay there on this cold marble floor of a 43rd floor apartment overlooking the Chicago skyline, and she thought, this is what I have become. If you've ever had someone convince you, slowly and completely, that you deserved exactly what they were giving you, stay with this story. Because what happens next is going to change the way you think about wrong numbers, right men, and the difference between being saved and saving yourself. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. You do not want to miss what comes. And drop a like, then tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The thing about Wesley Carrington was that he had never once, in all the time Imani had known him, looked dangerous. That was the trick of it. That was the entire architecture of what he had built between them. He was 41 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, with the kind of face that made juries trust him instinctively. Sharp jaw, careful eyes, a way of holding his shoulders back that communicated authority without arrogance. He'd made partner at Harrington and Voss before he was 35. His photograph appeared in Chicago Magazine's annual list of most influential attorneys 3 years running. His name appeared on charitable donor walls in 4 different hospitals. He was exactly the kind of man that Imani's world, her colleagues, her neighbors, the women who smiled at her across benefit tables, told her she was lucky to have. And for a while, early on, she had believed that. She was 25 when they met. She was working then as a forensic accountant at Dalton & Kerr Financial, tracking irregularities in corporate filings, finding the things companies tried to bury inside legal language and misdirection. She was good at it, extraordinarily good, her supervisor said, the kind of precision instinct you couldn't train someone to have. She'd built it out of necessity, growing up with her brother Desmond on the South Side after both parents died within 18 months of each other, learning early that the only way to protect yourself was to understand exactly what was in front of you. Wesley had charmed her for 4 months before she said yes to dinner. She thought that patience was a sign of respect. She didn't yet understand that patience, in the wrong hands, was just a longer form of strategy. The first year was almost flawless. I was attentive without being controlling, opinionated without being dismissive, generous in ways that felt genuinely thoughtful rather than transactional. He remembered that she drank her coffee black. He knew which questions to ask about her work without making her feel interrogated. He met Desmond twice and was polite in the careful way that told her he was performing it. But she told herself that was just shyness. She told herself a lot of things that first year. By the second year, the architecture had shifted in ways she kept trying to explain away. He suggested, always suggested, never demanded, not yet, that her late hours at Dalton & Kerr were affecting her health. He worried about her. He said it with such genuine-looking concern that she found herself actually wondering if she did look tired, if she had been pushing too hard. He suggested she take a leave of absence. Just a short one, just to recover. She took the leave. Then he suggested, gently, always gently, that going back full-time seemed premature, that he made enough for both of them, that he hated watching her exhaust herself when she didn't have to, and somewhere between his concern and her own exhaustion, she had let her career slip away from her like something she'd set down, meaning to pick back up and simply never did. By the time she understood what had happened, she was already inside a version of her life that she barely recognized. He controlled their social calendar, which meant he controlled who she spent time with. He reviewed her phone, not aggressively, just casually, the way he framed it, just curious about her day. And over time, the discomfort of those reviews made her stop reaching out to people who might ask the wrong questions. Her college friends dropped away first, her work contacts next. And Desmond, who had raised her, who would have driven across the city at 3 in the morning and asked 0 questions. Desmond she'd been quietly steered away from through a slow campaign of remarks about how Imani's family had always made her anxious, how their relationship complicated her healing, how it might be healthier for her to establish some distance. She had believed him. That was the part she would need years to forgive herself for. The violence came later, not all at once. First, it was a grip on her arm that lasted a few seconds too long, hard enough to leave a mark she covered with long sleeves in January. Then a shove against a wall during an argument that he apologized for so completely and genuinely that she almost forgot it had happened. Then a slap, just once, and then not just once, and always followed by the kind of careful, exhausted remorse that made her feel as though she was the problem for not moving past it faster. He never hit her anywhere that would show at a gala. He was a lawyer. He understood evidence. Tonight had been different only in degree. They'd attended a dinner hosted by Alderman Frank Dobbs. Political money, old connections, the kind of event where Wesley worked the room like a machine and expected Amani to smile and say very little. But she'd made the mistake of correcting him. Just a small correction, almost nothing. He'd misstated a figure in a story he was telling, and she'd said, casually, because she'd been a forensic accountant and numbers lived in her bones, actually it was closer to 14 million, wasn't it? The table had laughed, pleasantly, moving on. Wesley's face had not changed at all. She'd known, riding home in the back of the car, exactly what was waiting for her. She just hadn't realized how bad it would be this time. He'd hit her twice before she fell. The counter caught her ribs on the way down, and she heard one of them give, not a pop, more of a deep, interior crack, the kind of sound that comes from inside your body and makes your brain go momentarily white. She couldn't stand. She couldn't straighten. Every breath required concentration and still felt like failure. Wesley stood over her for a moment. She could see his shoes, Italian leather, hand-stitched, recently polished. He crouched down and touched her jaw with 2 fingers, almost gently, the way you'd check a piece of furniture you'd bumped to make sure you hadn't damaged it. "I need you presentable tomorrow night," he said. "Conceal whatever needs concealing." He placed her phone face down on the floor beside her, just out of reach. Then he stood, shrugged on his coat, and left for what he'd told her earlier was a private dinner with a client she wasn't to ask about. The elevator hummed. The penthouse went still. Amani lay on the cold floor and breathed in and breathed out, and did not cry, because crying required muscles in her torso that she couldn't afford to use. She didn't know how long she lay there before she moved. Long enough for the skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows to cycle through a full sequence of lights. Planes crossing, a helicopter making a low pass, the distant blink of a signal tower she'd watched 1,000 nights running. Then she moved. Not fast. Not smoothly. She got her elbow under her and pushed, gasped at the pain, pushed again, and managed to get herself propped against the base of the kitchen island. Her phone was 2 feet to her left. She reached for it, and the movement across her torso made her vision go gray at the edges. But she got it. 3% battery. 1 message, maybe 2 if she was careful. She opened her contacts and found Desmond. His name sat at the top of her recent list, even though she hadn't called him in weeks. Maybe 2 months. The last time Wesley had been traveling, and she'd had 30 minutes of what felt like air. She typed fast because her hands were shaking, and she knew the battery would not wait for her to be precise. "He broke my ribs. I can't breathe. Door locked. Please help." She hit send. The phone screen went black immediately, the way a phone does when the last particle of charge gives out. Not a gradual fade, but a sudden, complete darkness, like something deciding it was finished. She held it anyway, both hands wrapped around a dead piece of glass and metal because it was the only thing she had. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that she'd transposed the last 2 digits of Desmond's number. A 7 for a 9, a 9 for a 7. A difference of 2 digits between her brother on the south side and a man she had never met, had never heard of, would never in her ordinary life have had any reason to encounter. A man who, at that exact moment, was sitting at a long conference table in a private room on the 22nd floor of a building 3 miles north, reading shipping manifests and listening to 2 of his lieutenants argue about port access contracts with the kind of flat patience that came from having heard the same argument 17 times. Han Ji-woo was not the kind of man whose phone received personal messages. His private number. Not the one his business contacts knew, not the one used for organizational communications, but the one used only for family, of which he had very little remaining, existed precisely because it was unknown. He kept it exactly as protected as everything else in his life, which was to say, Absolutely. So when the message arrived, the first thing he felt was confusion. He looked at the screen. He read it twice. He looked at the number, Chicago area code, nothing he recognized. His security chief, Kwon Min-jae, noticed him stop mid-sentence and said nothing. Min-jae had worked with Ji-woo for 9 years. He'd learned to read the quality of Ji-woo's silences the way other men learn to read weather. "Wrong number," said one of the lieutenants, who had glanced across the table. Ji-woo didn't respond. He was still looking at the screen. "He broke my ribs. I can't breathe. Door locked. Please help." The words were simple. They were not the words of someone performing distress. There was no punctuation except the period at the end, no capitalization, no emoji. Just the flat, exhausted truth of a person who didn't have time or battery left for anything more complicated than the facts. He had seen that kind of language before. In a hospital room in Seoul, when he was 17, reading a note his mother had left for him before she checked herself out of the emergency ward against medical advice because she was afraid of what his father would do if she stayed. She had written it on the back of a prescription form in the same handwriting she'd used when she was just tired. Not dramatic, not desperate looking, just, "I had to go. Be careful. I love you." He had never forgiven himself for not getting there sooner. Ji-woo set his phone face down on the table, then picked it back up. "Trace the number," he said. "Give me the address attached to it." Min-jae didn't ask why. That was what 9 years was worth. The meeting continued. Ji-woo sat through it. He nodded at appropriate moments and made 2 decisions about the port contracts and declined to approve a proposal that would have put 3 of his people in a position he didn't consider defensible. He did all of this while a thread of something he had not felt in a long time ran underneath every minute, quiet and insistent. 18 minutes later, Min-jae's phone lit with a response from their intelligence contact. Ji-woo read the address. Then he was already standing, reaching for his jacket. "Cancel the rest," he said. "Let's go." The Gold Coast was 20 minutes at that hour, less the way Ji-woo's driver moved through the city. 3 vehicles, no markings, parking in the underground structure before the building's security cameras could register plates properly. Ji-woo knew which buildings had security arrangements that slowed things down and which buildings had security arrangements that collapsed under a direct conversation with the right kind of man. This building's night supervisor took one look at Min-jae and decided he was going home without an incident on his record tonight. The elevator went to 43. Ji-woo knocked once, a courtesy, not a question. Then Min-jae put his shoulder into the door. The lock held for approximately 2 seconds. Ji-woo walked into the penthouse and found her on the floor between the kitchen island and the window, her back against the cabinet, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked up when the door came open and he saw her face. The swelling already purpling along her left cheekbone, the way she was holding herself, the short, controlled breaths she was taking because the longer ones hurt too much. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her. He didn't say it's okay because it wasn't. He didn't say you're safe because he wasn't certain yet, and he didn't make promises he couldn't guarantee. He said nothing for a moment. He just looked at her. "I'm going to pick you up," he said. "It's going to hurt. I'll try to make it hurt less." She looked at him. This man she did not know, in a coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, with 3 other men behind him in the doorway. And something in her that had been clenched for 2 years simply had nothing left to clench with. She nodded. He was careful, slower than she expected. He got one arm under her knees and one behind her back and lifted her in a single motion that was still painful but not catastrophic, and he adjusted when she made a sound, tilting to take the pressure off her right side. They were almost to the elevator when the doors at the far end of the room opened and Wesley Carrington walked in. He stopped. He looked at Ji-woo. He looked at Imani. Then, with the exact speed and confidence of a man who had spent his career turning moments like this into advantages, he pulled out his phone. "I don't know who you think you are," Wesley said, his voice perfectly controlled, "but what you are right now is a kidnapper, and I have a building full of cameras and a judge on my speed dial, and by the time you reach the street—" Min-jae stepped forward, just one step. He didn't say anything. Wesley stopped. It was something about the way Min-jae moved, or maybe the way he didn't, the way he stood there with the absolute stillness of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice because he'd never once needed to. That made Wesley's calculation visibly shift. Ji-woo looked at Wesley Carrington for approximately 4 seconds. Then he turned back to the elevator without responding. Imani was watching Wesley from over Jiwoo's shoulder. Wesley was watching Jiwoo. For the first time in almost 2 years, nobody in that room was watching Imani at all, waiting to see what she would do wrong next. In the elevator, descending, she looked up at the man carrying her. Korean, mid-30s, jaw set, eyes already moving to his phone to handle whatever needed handling next. "You're Mafia," she said. She'd seen his face before, she realized. Somewhere, in some article, some mention she'd half read. She hadn't remembered it then. She remembered it now. He looked down at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. "Does that scare you more than staying there?" She thought about the locked door, the marble floor, the sound her rib had made. "No," she said. Her head found his shoulder and her eyes closed, and she was unconscious before they reached the ground floor. She had sent a message to the wrong man. She had no way of knowing yet that she'd reached exactly the right one. Imani woke up angry. Not frightened, not grateful, not the soft, disoriented confusion of someone coming out of sleep in an unfamiliar room, but angry, in the deep chest way that comes when your body has been given enough safety to finally feel what it was too busy surviving to feel before. She was in a bed, a real one, not a hospital cot, but something with weight and quality, with sheets that had the particular smoothness of high thread count, and a pillow that had been placed at exactly the right angle to keep her neck from straining. There was an IV line taped to the inside of her left elbow. Someone had changed her into a plain gray shirt that wasn't hers. The room was large and quietly lit, with heavy curtains drawn against what looked like early morning light bleeding in at the edges. She lay there for approximately 10 seconds, cataloging all of it. Then she tried to sit up, and her ribs reminded her immediately and comprehensively that she had fractured 2 of them, and she dropped back against the pillow with a sound she would have preferred not to make. "Easy." The voice came from the corner. A woman, maybe 50, with the contained efficiency of someone who had spent a career in medical settings and had very little patience for patients who acted surprised by their own injuries. She crossed the room without hurrying, checked the IV line, checked Imani's pulse at her wrist with 2 fingers. "You have 2 fractured ribs," she said, "one on each side, which means your instinct to breathe shallowly is correct but unsustainable. You also have a grade 2 concussion and bruising across your left cheekbone that is going to look significantly worse before it looks better. You're on a painkiller that will take the edge off without compromising your cognition. Don't try to move quickly. Don't try to prove something." Imani looked at her. "Who are you?" "A nurse." She said it the way people say a nurse when they mean that's genuinely all you need to know about me. "Where am I?" "Somewhere safe." She adjusted the IV drip slightly. "Someone will come speak with you when you're ready." "I'm ready now." The nurse looked at her with the flat assessment of someone who had seen a great many people claim to be ready for things they were not ready for. "Your breakfast is on the table beside you. Eat something first." She left without waiting for a response. Imani turned her head. There was a tray on the nightstand. Something hot, something with actual substance, not a protein bar or hospital crackers. She was more hungry than she'd realized, and that annoyed her too, the way her body kept insisting on its own needs regardless of the circumstances. She ate. Slowly, because the act of lifting the spoon required her torso to cooperate, and her torso was filing grievances. But she ate all of it, because she was a woman who had learned a long time ago that maintaining your physical capacity was not optional when the situation required thinking clearly. By the time she set the tray back down, the door had opened. Han Ji-woo came in without knocking, which she supposed was his right, given that it was his house. He was wearing different clothes from the night before: dark pants, a gray shirt, no jacket, no performance of formality. He looked like a man who had been awake for a long time, but was experienced enough at it that the exhaustion didn't impair him, just compressed him slightly, like a material that gets denser under pressure rather than softer. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room and placed it beside the bed and sat down. Not too close. A deliberate distance. "How bad is the pain?" he asked. "Manageable." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "It's bad enough that I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Not bad enough that I can't have a conversation." He nodded. He appeared to accept that as a real answer, which was already different from most of the interactions she'd had in the past 2 years. "You need to know where you are," he said. "This is my estate. Lake Michigan side, north of the city. You're on the third floor. There are 8 men on the property at any given time. That number goes up after last night, but I want you to understand that none of them will approach this room without my instruction. The nurse you met is contracted privately and has no connection to any part of my business. She's here for you specifically. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because you needed medical attention, and I was not going to take you to a hospital where Wesley Carrington could find a record of your admission within 6 hours. The sound of Wesley's name in another person's mouth, said flatly, without care, as a simple noun, did something strange to Amani's chest. Not pain. Something that felt almost like air. You know who he is? She said. I know what he is, Jiwoo said, which is somewhat more useful. She studied him. He had the face of someone who had learned early to give nothing away unless he'd decided to give it, and he was giving her more right now than she suspected he gave most people. She couldn't figure out why, and not being able to figure out why bothered her more than almost anything else. You traced my number, she said. Yes. You broke down his door. The lock gave more easily than I expected. I texted the wrong person. You did. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the heavy curtains, she could hear water. The actual lake, close enough that it had sound, a low, continuous movement that existed underneath everything else. So explain it to me, she said. Because I'm a forensic accountant, I was a forensic accountant, and I don't accept explanations that amount to I just felt like it. You run an organization, you make calculated decisions. You traced a stranger's number at midnight and crossed the city with 3 vehicles. So explain what calculation produced that result, because I am going to sit here and be polite and not go anywhere. But I am not going to pretend that I believe it was pure altruism. Jiwoo was quiet for long enough that she thought he might simply choose not to answer. Then he said, My father broke my arm when I was 10 years old. She didn't say anything. I had called the police. There was a phone in the kitchen. I had memorized the number because my mother told me to, in case of emergency, and I used it. My father found me before the call connected. He took the receiver and put it back on the hook, and then he broke my arm at the forearm, cleanly, and told me that the next time I tried to involve anyone outside our family, it would be my mother's arm. He said it without theater, just the words, in the order they'd happened. I heard your message, he said. Not the words. The underneath of it. The way it was written. No punctuation except the period, no extras. Just exactly what was happening and what was needed. My mother used to communicate like that. Like she'd already spent everything she had on surviving and there was nothing left over for style. Amani looked at the ceiling for a moment. You kept the number, she said, after you realized it was a wrong number. I realized it was a wrong number at the same time I realized it didn't matter. She turned her head and looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the lake moved outside in its constant low voice. Thank you, she said. She said it like she meant it, which she did, but also like it was a transaction being acknowledged rather than an emotion being performed, because she didn't have the capacity right now for the other kind. He nodded. There's more, he said, and it's going to make the situation considerably more complicated. Tell me, he told her. He started with the Orlov Syndicate, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a briefing, the way you'd brief someone who was smart enough to handle facts if you gave them in the right order. Eastern European organization, 4 years building presence in Chicago. Primary target, the shipping corridors along the lakefront and into the port system, the same corridors that Jiwoo's organization had controlled through a combination of labor relationships, logistics contracts, and strategic financial positioning that had taken 15 years to construct. The Orlovs were not subtle. They were patient, but not subtle, and their patience had been burning off steadily as Jiwoo's network continued to hold what they wanted. Wesley Carrington, he told her, had been their American interface for at least 3 years. Wesley, she said, flat. Not a question exactly, more like someone pressing a bruise to confirm it's real. He launders their operational capital, has been for long enough that his own finances are now inseparable from theirs. Which means he is not simply a man who hits women and calls it a relationship. He is a man whose continued existence and freedom are functionally necessary to a violent criminal organization with significant resources. By taking me, Amani said slowly, you took something they needed. Yes. He paused. I didn't know that at the time. I know it now. She absorbed that. She was not a woman who panicked. Panic required a certain luxury of belief that things could be made worse by your reaction, and she had lived inside genuinely worsening situations long enough to understand that the only useful response to new information was to process it and recalibrate. "How exposed are you?" she asked. He looked at her with something that might, on a different face, have been the beginning of appreciation. "Significantly. Removing you from that apartment has given Orlov a pretext he didn't have before. He can now frame every previous action I've taken against his expansion as aggression rather than defense. He'll use it. So I made your situation worse. You sent a message that reached the wrong number. What happened after that was my decision." She looked at him carefully. He meant that. She could tell. He wasn't performing graciousness. He was stating accountability the way you state a fact that is simply accurate and doesn't require embellishment. Before she could respond, the door opened without a knock, and Min-jae came in with the specific energy of someone carrying information that needed immediate distribution, regardless of context. He said something in Korean, short, hard, not gentle about it. Ji-woo stood. What? Imani said. Already moving toward the door, he stopped. He made a decision about something that she could see happening on his face, even if she couldn't read all of it. "Wesley gave a press statement 20 minutes ago," he said. "He's holding a press conference in an hour." The press conference was on the television in the adjoining sitting room. One of Min-jae's people had the live stream running by the time Ji-woo got there, and Imani came in behind them moving carefully, one arm held slightly away from her body to manage the rib pain, her jaw set. Wesley was at a podium. He was wearing his best grief face, the one she'd seen him construct and dismantle in the mirror, the one that looked genuine because he'd practiced it until it was the way some people practice scales until the music sounds effortless. He was flanked by his communications assistant and a woman Imani recognized as a victims advocacy attorney he donated to at a fundraiser last spring. He was talking about fear. I was talking about manipulation. He was talking about how the woman he loved, his voice caught here, perfectly timed, had been approached by individuals connected to organized crime, had been frightened and confused, and how he was cooperating fully with law enforcement and begging, simply begging, anyone with information about Imani Caldwell's whereabouts to come forward. He said her name 4 times in 3 minutes. He said mentally fragile twice. He said history of emotional instability once, very carefully, with visible reluctance, as though it pained him to mention it, but honesty compelled him to. Imani stood in front of the television and did not move for the duration of the statement. When it was over, Min-jae muted the screen. Nobody in the room said anything. Then one of the younger men, one of Ji-woo's lieutenants, maybe 30, who had been standing near the window, made a sound, not quite a word, more a compressed version of the opinion he was forming. "He's building something," Imani said. Her voice was level. "He's not just responding, he's constructing an advanced narrative. Whatever comes next, whatever he and the Orlov people are planning, this press conference is meant to run ahead of it and establish my credibility as a variable. If anything goes wrong on their side, if anything surfaces, the story already exists. I'm unstable, I was already compromised. Nothing I say or show is reliable." She turned from the television. "He did it to me for 2 years privately," she said. "He just moved it onto a larger stage." Ji-woo was watching her. Min-jae was watching her. "You said I was a forensic accountant," she said to Ji-woo. Past tense. He forced me out of my career before I could understand why. But I was good at it. I need access to whatever financial documentation your organization has on him. Why? Because something about this doesn't add up, and it hasn't since you told me about the money laundering. She pressed the back of one hand to her forehead, thinking. You said he's been laundering their operational capital, but Wesley's a liability lawyer. His specialty is asset protection and corporate defense. He doesn't do that kind of work through ignorance. He's meticulous about exposure. For someone that careful to tie himself that completely to a criminal organization, the financial structure would have to be extraordinarily compelling. Almost, she stopped. Almost what? Ji-woo said. Almost like he didn't have a choice about some part of it. Min-jae looked at Ji-woo. Ji-woo looked at Imani. We have intelligence files, Ji-woo said. Some financial, some operational. I want to see them. You have fractured ribs. I'm aware. She met his eyes. Give me the files. They gave her the files. She spent 4 hours at a desk in the room adjacent to Jiwoo's main office, which she suspected he gave her specifically because it was away from the center of the house's activity, away from the conversations she didn't need to be part of, and the decisions being made at volume in Korean she couldn't follow. Min-jae brought her 2 additional pain medications, a coffee that was genuinely good, and a laptop that had been cleared of everything except the relevant documents. She worked the way she'd always worked, methodically, without drama, following the logic of numbers the way you follow a thread through a dark room, not looking for the dramatic discovery but for the small inconsistency that led to the next one that led to the one that actually mattered. She found it in the 3rd folder. Then the 4th confirmed it. Then the 7th made it irrefutable. The offshore accounts weren't just Wesley's laundering mechanism. They weren't in Jiwoo's name or in some shell corporation with a generic name or in the name of any of Wesley's known associates. They were in her name, Imani Caldwell, her social security number, her biometric identifiers, the ones she'd submitted during a routine financial compliance audit at Dalton & Kerr 4 years ago, before she'd ever met Wesley, when she'd been required as part of her employment to register with a federal financial tracking database. Someone had pulled that data. Someone had built a financial structure around her identity without her knowledge, and then systematically maneuvered her into a position where she was isolated, unemployed, financially dependent, and completely unable to perform the forensic analysis that would have revealed exactly what had been done to her. She sat back. The breath she tried to take caught on her ribs, and she let it shorten, controlled it, didn't let the pain be the loudest thing in the room. $40 million, according to the account records. $40 million sitting in 3 offshore accounts in her name, accounts that required her biometric authorization to access, accounts she hadn't known existed until 45 seconds ago. She was not collateral damage. She was the mechanism. She was the lock. And Wesley had spent 2 years keeping her confused, isolated, and frightened precisely because he needed her body present and her mind too compromised to understand what it was being used for. She stood up. She walked to Jiwoo's office and knocked once and opened the door without waiting. He was at his desk with Min-jae and 2 other men she didn't know, documents between them, a phone call on speaker that cut off immediately when she entered. She put the laptop on the desk in front of him and pointed at the screen. "Look at whose name is on the accounts," she said. He looked. His face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. A tightening, a recalibration happening quickly and without performance. "He put it in your name," Jiwoo said. $40 million, requiring my biometric authorization, which is why the Orlov Syndicate wants me alive and why Wesley never got rid of me regardless of how badly the situation deteriorated. I'm not a person to them. I'm a key." She kept her voice steady. "I'm the only thing standing between that money and whoever gets to move it." Min-jae said something in Korean, short, hard. Jiwoo responded without looking up from the screen. Then he looked at Imani. "This also means," he said carefully, "that as long as you are in this building, every resource the Orlov organization has will be directed toward recovering you. Not killing you. Recovering you. Which presents a different category of problem than—" His phone rang. It was not his personal phone. It was a secondary device. The one Min-jae controlled access to. The one used for external communications that required a level of verification. Min-jae answered it, listened for approximately 5 seconds, and then said something to Jiwoo that made every man in the room go still. Jiwoo looked at Imani. "Do you have a brother?" he said. "Desmond Caldwell, Southside mechanic." The floor shifted underneath her in a way that had nothing to do with medication. "What happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. Jiwoo held her gaze. "They have him," he said. The phone on Min-jae's desk rang a second time. A different phone, her phone, the one they'd charged and returned to her that morning as a gesture of trust. She already knew, before she picked it up, what it would say. The voice on the other end was flat, accented, and completely without cruelty, which made it worse than if it had been angry. "Your brother is alive. Come alone to the industrial harbor on the South Dock. You have 2 hours. If you contact anyone, if Han Jiwoo's people move anywhere in this city, the mechanic dies before you park the car." The call ended. Imani stood in the center of Jiwoo's office holding the phone at her side, and every man in the room was looking at her, and she understood with complete clarity that the choice she was about to make was the kind that didn't unmake itself. Desmond, who had raised her, Desmond, who had driven her to her first job interview in a car with a broken heater, who had taught her to check her oil and manage her taxes and stand up straight in rooms where she felt small. Desmond, who was on the south side right now because she had drifted away from him under Wesley's careful guidance, because she had let the distance grow, because she had believed for 2 shameful years that maybe Wesley was right, and the closeness to her family was part of what made her unstable. Desmond, who had done nothing except be her brother, was now in a warehouse at the harbor because of her. She looked at Jiwoo. He was already watching her face, reading it the way he read everything. Not intrusively, but completely, the way you read something you intend to respond to honestly. "Don't," he said. Quiet. One word. "I have to." "They will not release him. This is a mechanism, not a negotiation. They want you in that building." "I know what they want." Her voice didn't shake. She needed that. "I know exactly what they want. I have $40 million in biometric debt sitting in accounts they can't access without me, and I know that, and they know I know that, which means going into that building is the most dangerous thing I could possibly do. I know all of it." She held his gaze. "He's my brother," she said. Jiwoo looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Min-jae. Then he looked back at her. And she turned and walked out of the office, and she walked down the hall, and somewhere in the lower floor of the building, she found a set of keys hanging on a hook beside a service door that led to the maintenance garage, and she took them, and she found the vehicle they belonged to. A plain delivery van, no markings. And she drove it out of the estate before anyone who had a reason to stop her had gotten to the garage. The frozen city opened up around her. The harbor was 40 minutes south. She drove into the dark with 2 fractured ribs and $40 million attached to her name, and the absolute knowledge that she was doing the thing that every person who had ever tried to protect her would tell her was exactly the wrong move, and the equally absolute knowledge that there was not a single version of herself she could live with that walked away from her brother. The wrong number had found the right man. But right now, in the freezing dark of a January Chicago night, the right man didn't know which direction she'd gone. The harbor smelled like diesel and rust, and the particular cold of January water that had been sitting under ice long enough to forget it was ever anything else. Imani parked the van 3 blocks from the South Dock entrance because the last stretch of road was lit well enough that she'd be visible from the warehouse before she reached it. And visible before you chose to be visible was the kind of mistake that didn't give you a second attempt. She sat in the van for 45 seconds with the engine off, hands on her knees, breathing in the short, controlled way her ribs permitted, and she made herself inventory what she had. A phone with 63% battery and no plan to use it without triggering whatever monitoring the Orlov people had on Jiwoo's network. 2 fractured ribs that made sudden movement a negotiation between her brain and her body that her body didn't always win. A working knowledge of financial architecture that had taken 6 years to build and 2 years of enforced idleness to keep sharp through sheer stubbornness. And the particular clarity that comes when you have stripped away every option except the one in front of you and you understand, without comfort, that it is the only door left. She got out of the van. The wind off the lake hit her immediately. Not a gust, but a sustained pressure, the kind that gets inside your clothing and stays there, that makes your eyes water and your exposed skin go numb in under a minute. She hadn't grabbed a heavier coat. She was wearing the clothes Jiwoo's people had given her. Good quality, but not designed for standing on an exposed harbor dock at midnight in January. She walked. The South Dock was a working industrial facility, cranes dormant at this hour, shipping containers stacked in long rows that created corridors of shadow, the kind of geography that was useful to people who needed places to put things in conversations they didn't want overhead. There were lights mounted high on the crane structures, but most of them were on timers, and this was after shift end, so what remained was a scattered industrial half-dark that showed you the broad shapes of things without committing to the details. She found the warehouse because it was the only structure in the south lot with light coming from the interior seams. Not bright light, something lower, work lights or portable units, the kind you brought when you needed enough to see without advertising yourself to the building across the water. The side door was unlocked. She opened it and went in. The warehouse was vast and mostly empty. It had the feel of a space that had held things recently, but had been cleared, the floor showing the ghost rectangles of crates that had sat in the same place long enough to leave marks. The work lights were tripod-mounted, 4 of them, positioned to illuminate a central area without reaching the walls. The ceiling was a long way up and vanished into dark. Desmond was in the center. He was seated in a metal chair with his wrists zip-tied behind him and a second zip tie connecting the first to the chair back. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled enough to dry in a dark track down his face, and his left eye was swollen, but he was upright and conscious, and when he saw her come through the door, his face did something complicated. Relief and fury and grief arriving simultaneously, fighting for the same expression. "Imani." His voice was rough. "You should not be here." "I know," she said. "I'm serious. You need to leave, right?" "Desmond." She said it quietly, and he stopped. She had used that specific tone with him exactly twice in her life, both times in situations where arguing was a luxury they couldn't afford, and he recognized it and went still. She turned. There were 4 men in the warehouse that she could see. 2 near the far wall, one beside the tripod lights, one near the door she'd come through who had let her get 3 steps inside before making himself visible. They were not small men, and they were not carrying themselves like men who needed instructions about what to do next. They stood with the specific patience of people who had done this before, and understood that the people they were waiting for were going to come to them. Wesley stepped out from behind the second row of tripod lights. He was wearing a dark overcoat, his hands in his pockets, his face carrying the expression she recognized as his operational face, not the grief performance from the press conference, not the controlled charm from public events, but the stripped version, the one that existed when the audience was small enough that the performance cost more than it was worth. He looked at her ribs. "You look like you drove 40 minutes with 2 fractured ribs," he said. "I did." That was not a smart decision. Neither was building a $40 million financial structure around someone's identity without telling them, she said. And yet, something moved across Wesley's face, not quite surprise, but a recalibration. He hadn't expected her to know that. He'd expected her to arrive frightened and cornered and negotiating from the position of a woman who understood that her brother's life was the only card on the table. The recalibration lasted approximately 2 seconds before he controlled it. "Sit down," he said, and gestured toward a second chair that had been placed facing Desmond's. "I'll stand." "Imani?" "I said I'll stand." She kept her eyes on him. "I sat on your floor for 2 hours last January because I couldn't get up. I'm not sitting in your chair tonight." Wesley looked at her for a moment. Then he tilted his head slightly in what was not quite a concession and not quite nothing. "The accounts," he said. "You've seen them?" "Yes." "Then you understand the straightforward version of tonight. You authorize the transfer, we take you and your brother somewhere you can both be found by the appropriate people in the morning, and this is over. Simple exchange, clean outcome." "You're going to kill us," she said. "Imani?" "Wesley, I was your forensic accountant before I was your girlfriend. I understand what 40 million in unauthorized offshore accounts represents in terms of witness risk. I understand what the Orlov organization's operational history suggests about how they handle the people who can speak to that history." She looked at him without blinking. "You're going to kill us. The question I have is not about that. The question I have is why you built the accounts in my name in the first place, because that's the part I haven't figured out yet." Desmond made a sound in his chair. Not words, more the sound of a man who is listening to his sister describe her own murder with academic precision and finding it the most terrifying thing he's ever heard. Wesley looked at her for a long time. Then he sat down on a crate beside the lights, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected him to remain standing, to use height and positioning the way he always did in rooms where he needed the advantage. The fact that he sat down meant something. She filed it. "You want the truth?" he said. "I'm a forensic accountant. I always want the truth." He almost smiled. It was the ugliest thing she'd ever seen on a human face, that almost smile, because it was genuine. "I got into the Orlov arrangement 4 years ago," he said. "Before you. This is relevant because you think this was designed around you from the beginning, and it wasn't. I was managing their capital structure through a series of holding companies, standard arrangement, the kind of work that looks completely clean from the outside if you know how to dress it. I was good at it. I made them a great deal of money, and I kept it invisible, and for 2 years it was an extremely profitable professional relationship. And then something went wrong," she said, "and then their requirements changed." He said it flatly. The volume increased, the geography expanded. What had been a manageable structure became something that required a level of complexity I couldn't sustain through my existing mechanisms without creating exposure. I needed a different architecture, something with a human anchor, a real identity, real biometric credentials, someone with an established clean financial history who had no connection to any of this and whose name on an account would not flag anything. "You were already looking at me," she said. "I had been looking at you for 8 months," he said, "before we met. You were flagged in a professional database, forensic accountants with federal-level clearance, clean record, no political exposure. Your profile came up in a search." The warehouse was very quiet. Desmond was completely still in his chair. "You targeted me," Imani said. The words came out level. She was proud of that, not because she was performing strength, but because the steadiness was real, the product of 2 years of learning to put her feelings somewhere they wouldn't be used against her. "The dinner party where we met. The friend who introduced us. A contact of mine, yes. The first 4 months, all of it. The architecture of it, yes. Not—" He stopped. "Not what?" He looked at his hands. "The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Get the accounts established, manage the authorization protocols, find a way to make the biometric requirement transferable before the relationship needed to become substantial. But you couldn't make it transferable. The federal compliance system upgraded its encryption protocols 14 months into our relationship. What had been a workable extraction pathway closed. The biometric requirement became permanently anchored to your living physical presence." She understood it completely, all at once, the entire 2 years of her life assembling itself into a shape that made a terrible kind of sense. "So I became the key you couldn't copy," she said. "Yes. And you needed me close enough to access, but confused enough not to understand why." She breathed, short, controlled. "And you needed me discredited enough that if I ever did figure it out, no one would believe me." Wesley said nothing. "The career," she said, "the isolation, the press conference today. Every piece of it was—" She stopped herself. Not because she couldn't finish the sentence, but because finishing it out loud would cost her something she needed to keep. "You spent 2 years building a cage around me because you couldn't move $40 million without my fingerprint. Imani. Don't say my name." He was quiet. She stood in the cold warehouse with the work lights throwing harsh, angular shadows across everything, and she felt the anger, not the surface kind, not the frightened, reactive anger she'd felt on the penthouse floor, but the deep structural kind that comes from understanding exactly what has been done to you and by whom and for how long. It was not hot. It was very, very cold, the same temperature as the harbor outside, and she recognized it as the most useful thing she had ever felt. "The transfer," she said. "Walk me through exactly what you need." Wesley looked at her carefully. He was trying to read her the way he had always read her, looking for the tell, the sign of what she was actually thinking underneath what she was presenting. For 2 years, he'd been good at it. "Iris scan and fingerprint confirmation through the banking platform," he said. "The phone contacts the account interface directly. The authorization takes approximately 40 seconds. And after that, the funds route to a primary account and then fragment across 17 subsidiary channels within the hour, untraceable at that point. And we're released." He held her gaze. "Yes." She nodded slowly, like she was processing it, like she was a woman who had done the math and arrived at an unfavorable conclusion she was preparing to accept. She was not. She was buying time, which she had approximately none of, and she knew it. And the thing she needed most right now was something, any variable, any piece of this situation she could move. And she was scanning the warehouse with the part of her mind she kept behind her eyes for exactly this kind of inventory. The crane controls. She'd noticed them when she came in, mounted on the wall near the far door, a secondary panel, the kind used for manual override of the automated system when a full crane operator cab wasn't accessible. Old hardware, probably. This was a working facility, not a showroom. Old hardware meant analog fallbacks. Analog fallbacks meant that the automated system and the manual system ran on separate circuits. She'd spent 6 years tracing financial systems. Before that, she'd spent her childhood on the South Side watching Desmond strip and rebuild industrial engines in a garage that also served as their kitchen table on Sunday afternoons. She understood mechanical systems the way she understood financial ones, not as magic, but as logic you could follow if you were patient enough to find the beginning of the thread. She had 40 seconds of biometric compliance procedure to work with. She needed to be at that panel while Wesley's people were watching her phone screen. "Okay," she said, "I'll do the transfer." Wesley stood. Something in him relaxed. Not completely, not stupidly, but the specific tension of a man who had been managing a complex problem and had just watched it begin to resolve. He pulled out a tablet. He'd clearly had this prepared. The banking interface was already open, waiting for her biometrics. One of his men came forward with her phone, which they'd taken the moment she'd come through the door, and handed it to her. "Fingerprint first," Wesley said. "Then iris. The camera's on the tablet." She looked at the tablet. She looked at the phone in her hand. She looked at the crane control panel on the wall, 12 feet to her left. "I need to stand closer to the light to see the interface," she said. "My eyes, the concussion." The nurse said, "Avoid low-light screens." Wesley looked at her, then at the panel, then at her again. There was nothing about the crane panel that should mean anything to a woman who was about to surrender control of $40 million. It was just a wall-mounted box with switches, unremarkable, industrial furniture. He nodded at one of his men, who repositioned a tripod light. The new angle put Amani 4 feet from the crane panel. Close enough. She took the tablet from Wesley and positioned herself as though she was orienting to the screen, tilting it slightly to reduce glare, which was a completely reasonable thing to do with a screen, and also put her body at a 45-degree angle that meant the men near the door were looking at her left profile rather than her front. She raised her right thumb to the tablet's scanner. The scanner beeped. Processing, not yet confirmed. In the 3-second gap between the thumbprint read and the iris camera activation, while every eye in the warehouse was on the tablet screen, Amani's left hand found the crane panel and threw the main override switch. The warehouse ceiling screamed, not metaphorically. The crane mechanism above them engaged without warm-up, the way old industrial equipment engages when it's thrown on manually rather than cycled through its startup sequence. And the sound it produced was a shriek of metal and electric motor that hit every person in the warehouse like a physical impact. The tripod lights flickered, and 2 of them went out as the crane's power demand pulled from the same circuit. Desmond, who had grown up in the same garage Amani had, who had stripped and rebuilt crane-adjacent hoisting equipment since he was 14, heard that sound and understood it before Wesley's men did, and he drove his feet into the concrete floor and walked the chair backward into the shadow. Wesley spun toward Amani. She was no longer where she'd been standing. She was at the panel, and she was not throwing one switch but running her hand across the full manual override bank, not with precision, because she didn't have time for precision. And the crane above them began to move, wrong and massive and not following any programmed sequence, just responding to the override commands of a woman who understood the logical structure of industrial systems and was applying that understanding at speed in the dark. One of the Orlov men grabbed for her. She dropped. Not athletically, she went down hard, catching herself with both hands, and her ribs detonated with pain so complete that her vision went white for a full second. But she was on the floor and his hands caught air, and she rolled and the crane swung overhead, and a storage hook the size of a mailbox swept through the space where she'd been at shoulder height and caught the man who'd grabbed for her across the upper arm and put him into the wall. The sound he made was not something she would forget. Desmond had gotten out of the chair somehow. Or rather, he had gotten the chair to a point where the weakest point of the zip tie was against the chair's back edge, and the impact of driving himself into the concrete had snapped the plastic at the stress point, because Desmond Caldwell had been breaking things that needed breaking since he was 16 years old and understood exactly where to put the pressure. He came up with the chair in both hands and put it into the nearest man with everything he had. Wesley was screaming at his remaining people in a voice that had finally shed every layer of polish, raw and high and furious, the real voice, the one Amani had heard behind closed doors and had believed for 2 years was her fault for provoking. She heard it now from the floor of an industrial warehouse, and it sounded exactly like what it was, a frightened man who had just lost control of his architecture. She pulled herself upright against the wall. One of the Orlov men had gotten past Desmond and was 3 feet from her. She was out of moves. The man reached for her arm. A shot cracked through the warehouse, single, clean, not at her. The man's hand jerked back and he staggered, and Amani's brain registered wounded, not dead, hand or forearm, before she registered anything else because the clinical inventory was faster than the emotional one. Between two of the stacked containers along the warehouse wall, black tactical gear catching the edge of the remaining work light, Han Ji-woo came through with the specific economy of movement of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment and had calculated what that moment looked like. Min-jae was behind him. More men were behind Min-jae. Wesley saw them. He turned. He ran toward the back of the warehouse. Not because he had a plan, she realized, but because Wesley Carrington had spent his entire adult life running toward exits, and the exit was behind him, and his body had made the decision before his mind could evaluate it. Ji-woo didn't chase him. He crossed directly to Imani. He looked at her on the floor, at the way she was holding herself, at the white quality of her face. He crouched in front of her. "You drove here alone," he said. "Yes." "With 2 fractured ribs." "You've mentioned those before." Something moved through his jaw. Not quite anger, not quite the other thing. He put one hand on her shoulder, not to move her but just to place it there, and she felt the warmth of it through the fabric. "Can you stand?" he said. "Give me a second." She took the second. She took 2. Then she put her hand on his forearm and stood. Min-jae had Desmond, not restrained, beside him, checking his wrists where the zip ties had cut into the skin. Desmond was looking at Ji-woo the way a man looks at a person whose entire existence he is trying to categorize very quickly, because the category is going to determine his next several decisions. "You're the Mafia guy," Desmond said. "Yes," Ji-woo said. "You followed my sister here." "Yes." Desmond looked at Imani. He looked at Ji-woo. He looked at Imani again. "We're going to have a conversation about this at a later date," Desmond said to Imani, meaning all of it. The 2 years, the distance, the penthouse, the van, the harbor, all of it. "I know," she said. Then the warehouse exploded. Not literally, no fire, no structural collapse. But the doors at the far end, the loading doors that faced the harbor itself, blew inward with a sound like a car accident, and through them came men, more men than Imani could count. In the half-second she had before Ji-woo grabbed her arm and pulled her behind him, men in dark clothing and moving with coordinated purpose, spreading across the warehouse floor in a pattern that was not improvised. Ji-woo said something to Min-jae in Korean, fast and hard. Min-jae responded, and the response was short, and the expression that followed it on Ji-woo's face was the closest thing to concern she had seen on him. "What?" she said. "Orlov himself," Ji-woo said. "He's here." The man who came through the loading doors last was not large. That was the first thing Imani registered, because she had expected large, had expected the physical vocabulary of someone whose power expressed itself through size. Mikhail Orlov was medium height, broad through the chest, but not dramatically so, with gray-white hair cut close to his head, and the face of a man in his late 60s who had arrived at that age through a series of choices that had each been completely deliberate. He walked through his own men with the particular ease of someone who had never in his adult life been in a room that wasn't arranged around him. He looked at Ji-woo. He looked at Imani. His expression, when it landed on her, was not anger and not hunger, and not the performative cruelty she'd seen in movies about men like him. It was assessment, clinical and complete, the way you look at an object whose value you are confirming. "Ms. Caldwell," he said. His English was accented but precise. "I apologize for the circumstances. This was not my preferred method of introduction." "Mr. Orlov," she said. He almost smiled at that, at the fact that she knew his name, at the evenness of her voice. "You've been causing considerable trouble," he said. "I've been sitting in various rooms trying not to die," she said. "The trouble appears to have organized itself around me." This time he did smile. It reached his eyes, which were gray and very calm. "The accounts," he said. "We are going to resolve them tonight, one way or another." He looked at Ji-woo. "This does not need to be a confrontation between our organizations. I have no permanent quarrel with you. I have a financial instrument that requires a specific human component, and that component is standing 6 feet from me." Ji-woo said nothing. "If you step aside," Orlov said to him, "I will guarantee your organization's position in the Northern Corridor. You want the shipping contracts. You have them. Consider it a transaction." Ji-woo looked at him for a moment. Then he said in English, clearly and without heat, "No, no." Orlov's expression didn't change. He nodded once, slightly,
the way you nod when someone confirms the thing you expected them to say. "Then we have a problem," he said. And behind him, his men raised their weapons, and Jiwoo's men raised theirs. And between them stood Amani Caldwell, with 2 fractured ribs and a dead phone, and a forensic accountant's understanding of exactly how much money was sitting in her name, and exactly what every person in this building was willing to do to access it. Orlov looked at her. "You're a practical woman," he said. "I've done my research. You understand systems. You understand that a system only has 2 states, functioning or broken. Help me make this one function." She looked at him. She looked at the weapons on both sides of the room. She looked at Desmond, who was standing very still beside Minjai, with his wrists bleeding and his face a careful blank. She looked at Jiwoo, who was not looking at her. He was watching Orlov, reading the room, calculating something she couldn't fully see. And she understood, with the complete and terrible clarity of a woman who had nothing left to lose and no moves remaining, that the only thing standing between everyone in this building and a catastrophe was what she decided to do in the next 30 seconds. And that whatever she decided, the woman she was going to be on the other side of it was not the same woman who had driven here. The old Amani would have looked for the exit. She looked for something else. She said, "I want to see the transfer interface." Orlov looked at her. The room held its collective breath, every weapon still raised, every man still calculating the geometry of the standoff. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence, the way silence shifts when a variable enters a system that had been locked. "I want to see the exact routing," she said. "The primary account, the 17 subsidiaries, the complete architecture, before I touch anything." Orlov studied her. He was a man who had survived 6 decades of extraordinarily difficult situations by being a precise reader of people, and he was reading her now with everything he had. "You're stalling," he said. "I'm a forensic accountant," she said. "I don't authorize transfers I haven't examined. That's not stalling. That's the only professional standard I have left, and I'm keeping it." Something shifted in his face, not softening, but recognition. The recognition of a craftsman for someone else's craft. He gestured to one of his men, who produced a tablet. Jiwoo's hand closed on Amani's arm, not hard, but present, a contact that said, "I see what you're doing, and I don't know what it is, and I need you to know I'm here." She didn't look at him. She couldn't afford to look at him. Looking at him would tell Orlov something she needed Orlov not to know. She took the tablet. The transfer interface was exactly what Wesley had described. A private banking platform with biometric integration, the kind used by offshore financial structures that existed in the gray legal territory between multiple jurisdictions, where no single country's regulatory body had complete oversight. She'd seen similar architecture in her forensic work, always from the outside, always as the person trying to understand what had been hidden inside it. Now she was looking at it from the inside. She scrolled, slowly, deliberately, with the focused attention of someone genuinely examining what they were seeing, because she was reading every field, every routing notation, every account identifier, and she was doing something else simultaneously, something that required the part of her brain she'd spent 6 years sharpening and 2 years being told she didn't need. She was mapping it, the 17 subsidiaries, their jurisdictions, the timing protocols. The transfer had a 48-hour settlement window before the funds became inaccessible from the originating account. She filed that. The primary account's institution. She recognized the identifier prefix, a specific type of private clearinghouse that operated under a treaty framework between 3 countries, none of which were the United States. She filed that too. "Satisfied?" Orlov said. "Not quite." She scrolled back to the top. "The authorization is biometric, which means it's tied to a specific moment of consent, my consent, recorded and time-stamped. If the transfer is ever contested in any jurisdiction that recognizes the treaty framework, this institution operates under. That time-stamp becomes evidence of my participation in a financial transaction I didn't initiate and didn't benefit from." Orlov was very still. "I'm not saying that to threaten you," she said. "I'm saying it because I need you to understand that my cooperation has a specific value, and that value depends entirely on the transfer being structured in a way that doesn't create a legal instrument pointing directly at me." She held his gaze. "I need a modification to the routing, one subsidiary removed, the one registered in the jurisdiction that has a mutual legal assistance treaty with the DOJ."
She said it the way she'd said everything tonight. Level, specific, without drama. Orlov looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the man beside him. Not Wesley, a different man, older, with the specific look of someone who managed financial structures for a living, and said something short in Russian. The man responded. Orlov looked back at Imani. That modification requires a re-authentication of the routing structure. It will take 12 minutes. I can wait 12 minutes, she said. Jiwo's grip on her arm tightened by a fraction. She shifted her weight, just slightly, and her left elbow made contact with his forearm in a pressure pattern that was not accidental. Too short, one long, too short. It was Morse, or close enough to Morse, and she had no way of knowing if Jiwoo knew Morse. But she needed to communicate something, and this was what she had. She felt him go very still. Then, after approximately 3 seconds, his thumb pressed once against the inside of her wrist. He'd understood enough. What she'd communicated was the simplest version of what she needed: time, technology, distraction. What she needed from him was the distraction. She didn't know what he would do with that. She couldn't script it. She was trusting him to be the man who had traced a wrong number at midnight and driven across Chicago. And that trust sat in her chest alongside the rib pain, both of them real, both of them requiring management. The 12 minutes began. Orlov's financial man worked on the routing modification on a separate device. The men on both sides of the room had not lowered their weapons, but the specific pressure of the standoff had altered. When a negotiation is actively in progress, the calculus of violence shifts. Nobody shoots the person solving the equation mid-solution. Imani used the 12 minutes. She kept her eyes on the tablet, kept her expression in the focused professional register she'd established, and underneath that she was working through what she'd seen in the transfer interface with the systematic precision of someone who had spent 6 years finding the thing that wasn't supposed to be found. The 48-hour settlement window, the primary clearinghouse's treaty framework, and the specific account identifier she'd recognized, not from her forensic work, but from something more recent, something she'd read in Jiwoo's intelligence files 4 hours ago in the room off his main office. A notation in the margin of a financial document, handwritten, in English, in a handwriting she'd identified as Min Jae's based on the other annotations in the file. The primary account was accessible. Not to her, not directly, but it was accessible to anyone with the clearinghouse's internal authentication, which existed because regulatory frameworks required that even private institutions maintain a master verification pathway for court-ordered reviews. And the clearinghouse's internal authentication system had a public-facing portal, a portal that was accessible from any device with a browser. She needed Jiwoo's people to get a message to someone with the right legal standing to file an emergency asset freeze through the treaty framework, a federal financial crimes investigator, someone with DOJ authorization, someone who could, within the 48-hour settlement window, trigger a regulatory hold on the primary account that would make the entire transfer structure collapse before a single dollar moved. She needed all of this to happen without Orlov knowing she was attempting it, in a warehouse surrounded by armed men, with a phone that Orlov's people had taken when she walked in. Jiwoo had to move first, and she had communicated exactly nothing about the specifics of what she needed because she hadn't known the specifics until 30 seconds ago. She looked up from the tablet. She looked at Jiwoo. He was already looking at her. Not at Orlov, not at the weapons around the room, not at Min Jae. At her. With the focused, complete attention of a man who had decided something. He turned to Orlov. "This takes too long," Jiwoo said. "The harbor security rotation changes in 9 minutes. When it changes, this facility goes from dark to active monitoring. I'm telling you this as a professional courtesy. If your people are still inside this building when the Harbor Authority cameras go live on this section, you have a problem that makes this transaction irrelevant." Orlov looked at him. "You're bluffing," Orlov said. "The South Dock camera cluster was decommissioned in October," Jiwoo said. "The replacement system went active 11 days ago. I know this because I have a contract with the company that installed it. The monitoring company's rotation schedule is something I pay to know because I use this harbor. The next active sweep of this sector begins in 8 minutes and 40 seconds. He said it with such complete flatness that the room shifted again. Orlov's head turned toward his security man with a question in it. The security man pulled out a phone. Jiwoo's eyes found Min Jae across the room, a look that lasted under a second, with a content Imani couldn't decode. Min-jae's hand moved to his pocket. Wesley, who had been standing near the far wall since Ji-woo's men had come in, not restrained, not engaged, simply present in the way that a man who has lost control of his own plan is present, which is to say, waiting to see which direction the collapse goes so he can position himself accordingly. Wesley saw Min-jae's hand move and took a step toward the door. One of Ji-woo's men stopped him, a hand on the chest. Not hard, just final. Wesley stopped. Orlov's security man was talking on his phone, fast and quiet. Orlov watched him. Everyone watched Orlov. Imani looked at the tablet in her hands. She looked at the browser bar at the top of the banking interface. She looked at the 8-digit account identifier she had memorized 40 seconds ago because she was a forensic accountant and memorizing sequences of numbers was something she could do the way other people memorize song lyrics, automatically, without effort, without even fully deciding to. She navigated away from the banking interface. No one was looking at her. She pulled up the clearinghouse's public-facing portal. Her fingers were not steady. The cold had gotten into them, and the pain medication was wearing down, and her hands had been shaking since she walked into the warehouse. But she had learned years ago that you don't wait for your hands to stop shaking. You work with shaking hands. She navigated to the regulatory inquiry section. She found the emergency contact pathway. She typed the account identifier. She typed Ji-woo's name, his legal name, the one that appeared on legitimate business registrations, the one with a paper trail that connected to the shipping contracts, and the legitimate businesses his organization had built as its public face. She typed authorization dispute, identity fraud, federal jurisdiction, requesting emergency asset freeze review, contact, Han Ji-woo, attorney of record TBD, flagged under MLAT Framework Article 14. She didn't know if Article 14 was correct. She was extrapolating from treaty structure language she'd read in graduate school. But a regulatory inquiry system wasn't going to reject a submission for citing the wrong article. It was going to route it to a reviewer who would call the number she typed next. She typed Min-jae's number. She had memorized it from the intelligence files. She had memorized it the way she memorized everything, without deciding to, just because it was there, and she was the kind of person who retained numbers the way other people retained faces. She hit submit. The tablet's screen returned to the banking interface. She looked up. Orlov's security man had finished his call. He was shaking his head at Orlov. The head shake of someone confirming something they'd hoped was false. Ji-woo's information about the cameras was accurate, or Orlov's man believed it was, which amounted to the same thing in this room, right now. Orlov looked at Ji-woo with an expression that was not anger. Anger was for men who were surprised. This was assessment, the calculation of someone who had miscounted something and was revising his count. 7 minutes, Ji-woo said. The modification is done, Orlov's financial man said. Orlov looked at Imani. Ms. Caldwell. She walked toward him. She carried the tablet. Her ribs were a sustained, complete presence that existed underneath every step. Not something she was managing anymore, so much as something she was simply including in her movements, the way you include weather when you're walking through it. She stopped 3 feet from Orlov. He was shorter than she'd registered from across the room. His eyes, at close range, were the gray of deep water. Not cold exactly, but bottomless. The kind of gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Fingerprint, he said. Then iris. She looked at the tablet. She thought about the submission she'd just sent. She had no way of knowing if it would reach anyone in time. She had no way of knowing if the regulatory framework worked the way she'd described it, or if the emergency pathway was staffed at 2 in the morning, or if Min-jae's phone was on and charged, and in a jurisdiction where it would receive an international routing call. She had no way of knowing if any of it worked. What she knew was that the transfer had a 48-hour settlement window. What she knew was that she was not going to give Orlov what he needed, not because she had a complete plan, because she had decided, somewhere between the penthouse floor and this harbor, that she was done making the choice that left her with less than she had before. She had authorized Wesley's control of her career. She had authorized the distance from Desmond. She had authorized, through her silence and her compliance, 2 years of being reduced. She was not authorizing this. She lowered the tablet. No, she said. The room cracked open. Not immediately. There was a half second where the word landed and everything absorbed it, and then Orlov's expression went through a shift that she had never seen on Wesley's face, which was the shift of a man who does not get told no and has not been told no in long enough that his response to it is purely physical. He reached for her arm. Jiwoo moved. Not from across the room. He had been moving for the last 90 seconds, repositioning with the incremental patience of someone who was choosing his moment and his angle. And when Orlov's hand extended, Jiwoo was already close enough that his response was immediate. No travel time. Just the sharp application of force at the wrist that broke Orlov's grip before it fully established. Orlov stepped back. His men raised weapons. Jiwoo's men raised weapons. And the harbor outside the warehouse erupted. The loading doors blew inward a second time. Not from Orlov's people, not from anything inside the standoff, but from outside, from the dock itself. And through them came the sound of vehicles, multiple vehicles, moving fast on the concrete apron, and lights, the particular spread of high-mounted lights that hit through every gap in the warehouse structure and turned the interior into a staccato of white and dark. Someone in Orlov's group shouted. The shout was in Russian, and Imani didn't speak Russian, but the emotional content was universal. That's not ours. It wasn't Orlov's. It wasn't Jiwoo's either. She could see Minjae's expression from where she stood, and Minjae looked as surprised as she felt, which meant this was a third variable. And a third variable in a room already containing two armed organizations and one contested financial instrument was the definition of catastrophic complexity. The lights resolved. Federal vehicles. 3 of them. Black, unmarked, with the specific configuration of agency deployment rather than local law enforcement. Behind them, 2 marked Chicago PD units, their red and blue cutting through the harbor dark. Someone had made a call that wasn't hers. Jiwoo. She looked at him. He was watching the doors with the expression of a man who was revising his calculation rapidly. Then she understood. The harbor camera information had been real. Jiwoo had told Orlov a true thing and used the truth as cover. When the cameras went live, they had captured the federal vehicles staging outside, and the staging had been triggered by someone who'd been watching this location, not because of her regulatory submission, not yet, but because the Orlov Syndicate's activity at the harbor had been under federal surveillance for a period she had no way of measuring, and the convergence of armed men at the South Dock at 2 in the morning had been the trigger someone had been waiting for. Orlov understood what was outside before most of his men did. I was a man who had evaded federal attention for decades through the precise management of exposure, and he understood immediately and completely that the exposure management had just failed, and that the window for managing it was closing at the speed of the federal agents currently positioning outside the loading doors. He looked at Imani. She held the tablet. She held the $40 million. She held the only thing that could move fast enough to be worth anything in the next 4 minutes. "Give me the authorization," he said. Quiet. Low. The word please wasn't in the sentence, but the need was, naked and cold. "No," she said again. He pulled a weapon from inside his coat. The room went rigid. Minjae said something sharp. Jiwoo said nothing. He was watching Orlov with the complete focus of a man who is running every scenario simultaneously and looking for the one where all 3 of the people he needs to keep alive stay alive. Orlov held the weapon aimed at Imani's center mass. She looked at it. She had never had a gun pointed at her before. She had imagined, in the abstract, that it would feel like the worst thing, the most terrifying fixed point in any situation. What it actually felt like was clarifying. All the noise of the room, the weapons, the vehicles outside, the shouting somewhere along the dock, the pain in her ribs and her hands, and the base of her skull. All of it went quiet, and what remained was the specific simplicity of one question. "What do you do now?" She raised the tablet. "You want this?" she said. "You need my biometrics. If you shoot me, you get neither. You get a body and a federal investigation and no access to $40 million for the rest of your life." Orlov's jaw tightened. "The cameras outside are already recording," she said, "which means federal investigators already have footage of you holding a weapon on a civilian witness in a building surrounded by your armed personnel. Which means the question of whether you are charged with my assault is already answered regardless of what happens next." She kept her voice steady. She needed it steady, and it was. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because the fear and the steadiness existed simultaneously in her, and she was choosing which one to give the room. But if you put the weapon down and walk out the loading doors before those agents breach, if you exit as a man in the wrong place at the wrong time rather than a man who took a hostage, you have something left to work with. Your attorneys have something left to work with. I know enough about legal structures to know that the difference between those two situations is the difference between a case that can be fought and one that cannot. Silence. The sound of the federal vehicles repositioning outside. Commands being called, not words she could make out, but the rhythm of tactical organization. Orlov was looking at her. "You're trying to save yourself," he said. "I'm trying to save everyone in this room," she said, "including you. Because if those doors open and your men are holding weapons, people die tonight. Maybe not me, maybe not Jiwoo, but people die. And dead men don't get to spend money or fight charges or do anything at all." She held the tablet up a little higher. "This doesn't move without me. It doesn't move tomorrow or next week or next year without me. You walk out of here knowing that's true. That's not nothing." Orlov looked at the tablet. He looked at his financial man who was already calculating something Imani couldn't see. He lowered the weapon. Not all the way. He lowered it to 45 degrees, which was a reduction of immediate threat, but not a commitment, a punctuation rather than a period. "Your submission went through," he said. "The regulatory inquiry. I had someone monitoring the clearinghouse portal." He looked at her steadily. "It won't freeze in time. The emergency pathway takes 36 hours minimum." "I know," she said. "Then why?" "Because it creates a record," she said. "A timestamp. An independent financial regulator's documentation that I disputed this transaction before it occurred. Which means when the transfer eventually clears, if it clears, there is a legal instrument in 3 jurisdictions establishing that it was contested, that I did not consent, and that the authorization, if obtained, was obtained under duress." She held his gaze. "You get the money, and you spend the rest of your life fighting a contestation that never expires. Or you walk out that door and we find out what 48 hours looks like when federal investigators have access to the account records. I'm going to hand them the moment this building is secured." The loading doors were hit from outside, not breached, a warning impact, the kind that precedes a breach by 30 seconds. Orlov looked at the doors. He looked at Jiwoo. He looked at Imani. He put the weapon back inside his coat. He said something in Russian to his men, 2 words, hard and final. His men began to move. Not toward Imani, not toward Jiwoo's people, toward the side exit, the one that faced the container yard rather than the dock. The one where the federal vehicles were not yet positioned because the staging had prioritized the loading doors and the primary access. Jiwoo's men stepped back to let them pass. Not because Jiwoo had instructed it, because Jiwoo understood, as Imani had communicated without saying it, that the federal agents outside were a more immediate threat to his organization's exposure than Orlov's retreating men, and that the cleanest outcome for everyone who was not Mikhail Orlov tonight was Mikhail Orlov walking out a side door rather than being apprehended inside a building where Jiwoo's people were also standing with weapons. Orlov was the last one to the side door. He paused. He looked at Imani one final time. "Extraordinary," he said. He didn't say it with admiration or with threat. He said it the way you say it about weather, a factual acknowledgement of something larger than expected. Then he went through the door. 20 seconds later, the loading doors came in. Federal agents in tactical gear, 4, then 8, then more behind them, poured through the opening with the organized momentum of a unit that had been patient long enough and was done being patient. They swept the room, weapons up, commands delivered in the flat commanding register of people who were not asking. Jiwoo's men went still, hands visible, no weapons raised. The specific stillness of people who had received instruction and were following it precisely. Jiwoo stood with his hands at his sides, Min-jae beside him. Desmond pressed against the warehouse wall with his hands raised and an expression of profound existential exhaustion on his face. The agent who reached Imani first was a woman, mid-40s, tactical vest, dark hair pulled back, the particular no-nonsense expression of someone who has been waiting outside a building for 40 minutes and wants answers before she wants courtesy. "Imani Caldwell," she said. "Yes," Imani said. "Are you injured?" "2 fractured ribs, concussion, various other things. Nothing currently critical." The agent looked at her, at the way she was standing, at the tablet she was still holding, at the complete exhaustion in her face that hadn't made it into her voice. "Do you know where Wesley Carrington is?" the agent said. Imani looked around the warehouse, the far wall, the position where she'd last registered Wesley standing. He wasn't there. She looked at the side exit, the door Orlov had used, the one facing the container yard. "He went out that way," she said. "Maybe 3 minutes ago, maybe 4. The agent touched her radio. Imani let out a breath, the full length of it, not the managed shallow version. She let the breath go all the way, and her ribs reminded her immediately of everything they had been through tonight, and she didn't stop the breath because she was done managing herself smaller than the moment required. Jiwoo was 10 feet away. He was watching the agent process Imani's information. When the agent stepped back to radio, he looked at Imani directly. She looked back. His face was doing several things at once, most of which she couldn't read. But one of them was the same thing she'd seen in the hospital room in his estate. That specific quality of attention that wasn't surveillance but was simply, "I am watching you because I cannot not watch you." She was about to say something when the radio in the agent's hand burst with a report. Fast, urgent, another agent's voice. And the content of it made the agent's expression shift from controlled to sharp. "Carrington is at the waterfront," the agent said, mostly to herself, already moving. Imani moved too. The agent tried to stop her, a hand on her arm, the instruction to stay back, and Imani looked at her. "He spent 2 years controlling every room I was in," she said. "I need to see this one." The agent looked at her for a moment. She let go of her arm. The waterfront was 40 yards from the warehouse, across the container yard through a gap in the fence, out onto the dock apron that ran along Lake Michigan's edge. The lake was frozen 4 feet out, and then open black water beyond, the kind of open water that absorbed light and gave nothing back. Wesley was at the edge. Not as a dramatic gesture. He was there because he'd run out of harbor. He'd come through the side exit, crossed the yard, and found the lake waiting where an exit should have been. He was standing on the concrete lip of the dock with federal agents on 3 sides, and the water behind him and the expression of a man whose entire architectural framework had just collapsed simultaneously. He saw Imani come through the fence gap. His face changed. Not to the grief performance, not to the operational calculation, something underneath both of those, something she had never seen from him in 2 years, which was the raw face of a person who had just understood that the outcome they had managed against for their entire adult life was actually, finally, here. "Imani," he said. "Don't," she said. "I need you to listen." "Wesley." She stopped 6 feet from him. The wind off the lake was direct and unmediated, and it cut through everything she had on, but she stood in it. "I listened to you for 2 years. I believed what you told me about myself. I made myself smaller and quieter, and I lost my career and my brother and my own sense of what was real because I listened to you." He had nothing to say to that. The agents were closing. She could hear them. She had maybe 30 seconds. "I'm not here to tell you anything," she said. "I'm here because you spent 2 years deciding what rooms I was allowed to be in, and I'm done letting you decide that." She held his gaze. "This is the last room. It's mine." Wesley looked at her. Behind him, the lake moved under its own enormous weight, indifferent, continuous. An agent's hand landed on his shoulder. Wesley's chin dropped. Not all the way. Not surrender exactly. More like a man accepting the first weight in what was going to be a very long series of weights. And Imani stood on the frozen dock of Chicago's South Harbor at 2:30 in the morning with fractured ribs and a dead phone and the specific bone-level exhaustion of someone who has spent everything they had and arrived, against all calculation, at the other side of it. She was not okay. She was going to need weeks and probably months and likely years to understand the full shape of what had happened to her and what it had cost and what it was going to take to rebuild from here. But she was standing. She was at the waterfront, and she was standing, and nobody in this city or any other was going to tell her which room she was allowed to occupy. Jiwoo came up beside her. He didn't say anything. He stood beside her in the wind off the lake and looked at what she was looking at, which was Wesley Carrington being walked toward a federal vehicle with his hands behind his back and his beautiful coat gathering around his legs in the wind, and all of his architecture undone. After a moment, Jiwoo said, "You submitted a regulatory inquiry from Orlov's tablet." "Yes." "Using Minjae's phone number." "Yes." A pause.
You memorized Minjae's phone number from the intelligence files. I memorize numbers, she said. I always have. He was quiet for a moment. The submission won't freeze in time, he said. I know, but it creates a record. She looked at the lake. There's a 48-hour settlement window. If federal investigators get access to the account documentation in that window, which they will, because I'm going to hand it to them the moment someone gives me a working phone, the treaty framework allows for an emergency judicial hold that supersedes the settlement timeline. Jiwoo turned and looked at her. You were going to give them everything, he said, including anything connected to my organization. Yes, she said. She said it without apology because she wasn't going to apologize for it, and she held his gaze because she wasn't going to look away from it either. He looked at her for a long time. I know, he said. He said it the way you say something you've already made peace with. I won't pretend that doesn't complicate things for you, she said. No, he said. It does. He looked back at the dock, at the vehicles, at the controlled, organized aftermath of a situation that had stopped being controlled approximately 2 hours ago. I've been managing exposure for 15 years. I'll manage this. She believed him. She also believed that managing it would cost him, and that he knew that, and that he was standing next to her anyway. The agent who'd first spoken to her in the warehouse came through the fence gap and moved toward Amani with the specific expression of someone who has a great deal of questions and has been patient about it long enough. Ms. Caldwell, she said, we need to get you medical attention and we need to take your statement. I know, Imani said. I have financial documentation you need to see. Account records, routing information, and a regulatory submission time-stamped 40 minutes ago that establishes the basis for a judicial asset hold. I need a phone, and I need 15 minutes, and I need someone with DOJ financial crimes authorization to be on the other end of the call. The agent stared at her. You've got 2 fractured ribs, she said. I'm aware of my ribs, Imani said. The phone. Can you make that happen? The agent looked at her for another moment, the look of someone recategorizing what they thought they were dealing with. And then she reached into her vest pocket and handed Imani her phone. Imani took it. She looked at the screen. She looked at Jiwoo, who was watching her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of something he wasn't going to say out loud because the moment didn't have room for it, and he understood that. She looked at the lake. Then she made the call that was going to bring down $40 million, 1 corrupt attorney, and the better part of an Eastern European criminal organization's American financial infrastructure. And she made it standing on the frozen waterfront of Chicago in the dark, with the wind in her face and her ribs on fire, and the absolute knowledge that this was the moment everything stopped being done to her and started being done by her. The call lasted 22 minutes. Imani stood on the frozen dock the entire time, not because she couldn't have moved somewhere warmer, but because moving felt like a concession to something she wasn't ready to concede, and because the cold was real and immediate and kept her present in a way that the alternative, sitting somewhere quiet, while her body started to understand the full inventory of what tonight had cost it, did not. The DOJ financial crimes investigator who answered was a man named Reeves. She never got his first name, he didn't offer it, and she didn't ask because neither of them had time for the social architecture. He was alert and precise in the way of someone who had been sleeping lightly and waiting for a call like this for a period he'd stopped counting. She gave him the account identifier. She gave him the clearinghouse institution's regulatory reference number, which she had memorized from the transfer interface the same way she memorized everything, without deciding to, just because it had been in front of her and her brain was the kind of brain that held numbers like water holds temperature. She gave him the treaty framework citation and the 48-hour settlement window and the timestamp of her regulatory submission and the jurisdictional basis for the judicial hold she was asking him to pursue. He asked her 2 clarifying questions. She answered both of them without hesitation. He was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, "Stay accessible. We'll need your formal statement within the hour." "I'll be here," she said. She handed the phone back to the agent. The agent was looking at her the way people had been looking at her all night, with the expression of someone revising a category they'd thought was fixed. Imani had been assessed as victim, as hostage, as unstable, as leverage. She was none of those things, or she was all of them simultaneously, and the categories didn't matter as much as what she did inside of them. She turned from the lake. Jiwoo was still there, 10 feet back,
hands in his coat pockets, watching the federal vehicles process the scene with the particular attentiveness of a man calculating what the next 72 hours were going to require. Min-jae was beside him, on himself. A quiet, rapid conversation that had been running since the agents came through the warehouse doors, the organizational mechanics of a structure adjusting to new conditions in real time. Desmond was sitting on a concrete barrier near the fence gap, both forearms on his knees, a federal medic crouched in front of him, attending to his wrists. He was watching Amani. He had been watching her since the moment she came back through the fence, and his face had the specific expression of a man who has too many things to say and has correctly identified this as not the moment to say any of them. She walked to him. The medic stepped back to give them room. Amani sat down on the barrier beside her brother. It required lowering herself carefully, managing the ribs, and she didn't try to make it look easier than it was. She sat down, and she let the cold concrete take her weight, and she sat there for a moment before she said anything. Desmond looked at her. "You drove 40 minutes alone," he said. "Yes." "With broken ribs. 2 fractures, technically different from broken." "Imani." "I know," she said. He looked away. At the lake, at the vehicles, at the sky that was beginning its almost imperceptible shift from black to the deep blue-gray that preceded Chicago's January dawns. "I should have come sooner," he said, "when you started going quiet, when the calls stopped. I knew something was wrong, and I told myself you needed space, and I—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I left you in there." "He made it very convincing," she said. "That's what he was good at. That's what he does." "I should have pushed harder." "Desmond." She waited until he looked at her. "You taught me to check my oil. You drove me to my first job interview in that car that had no heat. You were at my college graduation in the 3rd row with a sign you made yourself that said Caldwell's Finest, and you misspelled finest, and you were so proud of it you kept it in your garage for 2 years. She held his gaze. "You did not leave me. He separated us. There's a difference, and you need to hold on to that difference." He looked at her for a long time. Then he pulled her into a hug, carefully, because he knew about the ribs, and she felt him feel for the angle that would put the least pressure on her right side before he let his arms settle. It was the most Desmond thing she'd ever experienced, and it hit her somewhere behind the sternum in a way that the entire night had not, because the entire night had required her to be the person managing the situation, and this was the first moment in hours when someone else was managing something, and that something was her. She let him. She didn't cry. She thought she might at the edges of it, but the tears didn't come. She was too dehydrated, too depleted, too much of her remaining capacity directed toward the things that still needed doing. But she stayed in the hug for longer than she had allowed herself to stay anywhere tonight, and when she pulled back, she felt the specific settledness of someone who has confirmed that the thing they were most afraid of losing is still there. "The car," Desmond said. "Which one?" "The one you stole." "I borrowed it. From a Mafia boss. He left the keys on a hook." Desmond looked at the sky. "I need more information," he said, "about a lot of things." "I'll tell you everything," she said, "when we're somewhere warm and they've given you something for your wrists." The federal processing of the scene took 4 more hours. Imani gave her formal statement to Reeves's colleague, a woman named Sharp, 30s, with the exhausted efficiency of someone who had worked financial crimes for long enough that nothing surprised her anymore, which Imani appreciated because it meant she could give the facts without managing anyone's reaction to them. She gave the statement sitting in the back of a federal vehicle with a space blanket over her shoulders and a container of coffee that was not as good as Jiwoo's but was hot, which was the only criterion that mattered at 5:15 in the morning. She gave them the account architecture, the offshore structure, the clearinghouse identifier, and the routing details she'd seen on Orlov's tablet, the specific manner in which Wesley had built the accounts around her identity, the forged documents, the manipulated signings, the federal compliance audit data that had been accessed without her knowledge. She gave them dates, sequences, logical connections between pieces of evidence she had assembled from Jiwoo's intelligence files and her own 4 hours of forensic analysis earlier in the night. Sharp typed. She asked precise clarifying questions. She did not express sympathy or admiration or any of the social responses that would have required Imani to manage them. She was a professional receiving professional information, and Imani was grateful for it. At one point, Sharp looked up from her laptop and said, "The regulatory submission you filed from the Orlov tablet, that was the timestamp we needed for the judicial hold. Our own surveillance had the account flagged but lacked the direct victim dispute notation to trigger the emergency freeze under the treaty framework. What you filed created the legal basis." Imani held her coffee with both hands. "Did the hold go through?" she said. "2 hours ago," Sharp said. 40 million and change. Frozen pending judicial review in 3 jurisdictions. Imani looked at the fogged window of the federal vehicle. "Good," she said. She gave them everything about Wesley. The abuse documentation, the timeline, the isolation, the career dismantlement, the press conference framing that had been designed to preemptively destroy her credibility as a witness. She gave it in the same flat factual register she'd used for the financial information, because she had decided, somewhere on the dock, that she was not going to treat the 2 categories of crime differently. What he had done to her money and what he had done to her body were both evidence, and she was going to present both with equal precision and let the investigators and the prosecutors do their work. It cost more than she let show. She knew that. The cost was real, and she wasn't pretending it wasn't, but she had spent 2 years paying costs she hadn't chosen. Choosing this one was different enough to matter. Wesley Carrington was apprehended at the harbor's east perimeter at 3:14 in the morning. He had made it approximately 600 yards from the warehouse in the container yard before a federal agent following the monitoring feed from the newly active South Dock cameras located him behind a row of 40-foot containers, his Italian leather shoes destroyed by the ice and the frozen gravel, his overcoat insufficient against the sustained January cold that had been sitting at 12 degrees since midnight. He was not dramatic about the arrest. That surprised the agents, or seemed to. It didn't surprise Imani when Sharp told her. Wesley had always understood with perfect clarity when a performance was no longer serving him. He would save the performance for the courtroom, where he would, for a long time, continue to believe, that he could construct an architecture that survived the evidence. He was wrong about that, but he wouldn't know how wrong for another 8 months. Mikhail Orlov was not apprehended at the harbor. He had made it out through the container yard in the window between Ji Woo's men stepping aside and the federal perimeter fully closing, and he had resources and prepared exit protocols that had been in place longer than any single operation. He was in international territory within 6 hours of leaving the warehouse. He was arrested 14 months later in a jurisdiction where the treaty framework Imani had cited applied directly, extradited on charges that included financial conspiracy, criminal racketeering, and organized criminal enterprise across multiple countries. The $40 million freeze became the central exhibit in a federal case that took 3 years to fully prosecute and ultimately resulted in the forfeiture of assets across 4 countries. Imani knew none of that on the dock at 5 in the morning. What she knew was that the call had been made, the hold was in place, and the 48-hour window was running, and that what happened inside that window was no longer something that depended on her body being present and her compliance being extracted. She had broken the mechanism. The sun came up over Lake Michigan at 7:12. It was the particular winter sunrise that Chicago occasionally produced. Not warm, never warm in January, but extraordinary in its light, the way the flat lake caught it and spread it across everything in a low, cold gold that made even the industrial harbor look like something deliberate. Imani watched it from outside the federal vehicle, standing with the space blanket still around her shoulders. The coffee finished, her ribs a sustained and comprehensive presence that had stopped being manageable and started being the thing she was moving around. Ji Woo came to stand beside her. He had been inside the federal conversation for 2 of the last 4 hours, not as a suspect, or not only as a suspect, but as what Sharp had described carefully as a material witness with organizational intelligence relevant to the Orlov investigation. Whatever had been said in those conversations, Imani didn't know. She suspected she would never know all of it. The arrangement between a federal investigation and an organization like Ji Woo's existed in a legal and ethical territory that she had no interest in mapping right now, and possibly ever. What she knew was that he was standing beside her watching the sunrise, which meant he had walked out of the federal vehicle rather than into one. "They'll want more from you," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you going to give it to them?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some of it." She nodded.
She had expected that answer, and it was an honest one, which was what she'd needed it to be. The Orlov corridor, she said. The shipping contracts he offered you. Not the way he was offering them, Jiwoo said, but eventually. He looked at the lake. The harbor doesn't go away because one organization loses its position in it. The work still has to be done. The contracts still have to be managed. He paused. I'll manage them the way I've always managed things. Some of it cleaner than others. She looked at him. That's an honest answer. I don't see the point of being anything else with you, he said. You've demonstrated that you can be honest back. She almost laughed. It was a sound she hadn't made in a long time. Not a full laugh, more the beginning of one, the shape of it. And it surprised her when it came. He looked at her when she made it, the way you look at something you weren't expecting and weren't sure you'd see again. The medic came and told her it was time to go to the hospital. She went. The hospital was 3 hours of the particular institutional indignity that hospitals specialized in: bright lights, paper gowns, the cold efficiency of people doing their jobs in a system designed for throughput rather than attention. The 2 fractured ribs were confirmed by imaging. The concussion was reclassified as moderate rather than grade 2, which the attending physician said with the tone of someone delivering news they expected to be worse received than it was. The bruising on her cheekbone was extensive and would be photographed by the federal investigators as evidence, and she submitted to that process with the same flat professionalism she'd applied to the financial statement. Desmond was in the waiting area the entire time. He was there when she came out, sitting in a plastic chair with his wrists bandaged and a hospital coffee he hadn't touched going cold beside him, his eyes moving to the door the moment it opened. He stood up. She looked at him. I'm okay, she said. Or I will be. It takes a while. I know, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She believed him. That was the thing about Desmond. She had always been able to believe him, even through the 2 years she'd been steered away from him, even when Wesley's version of her family had overlaid the real one. The real one was standing in a hospital waiting room in bandaged wrists at 8:30 in the morning, having spent the night zip-tied to a chair. And he was still there, and still upright, and still looking at her like she was the person he'd raised and was proudest of. She crossed the waiting room and sat down in the plastic chair beside him. They sat there together for a while without saying anything. That was enough. The weeks that followed were not clean. Amani had not expected them to be clean, but the particular texture of the difficulty surprised her in places. There were the obvious things, the federal statements, the evidence reviews, the meetings with prosecutors who were building the case against Wesley and needed her at the center of it. There were the medical appointments, the rib progression checks, the concussion follow-ups that ran for 6 weeks and required her to spend 2 of those weeks in a lightened version of her days. No screens for longer than an hour, reduced cognitive load, a set of restrictions she found maddening and observed anyway because she had not survived a January harbor to damage herself through impatience. And there were the less obvious things. The night, 2 weeks after the harbor, when she woke at 3 in the morning in the room she'd rented in a furnished apartment on the north side. Not Jiwoo's estate, not anywhere connected to anyone, her own place, her own choice, and lay in the dark and felt, for the first time without the adrenaline of immediate crisis keeping it at bay, the full weight of 2 years. Not the dramatic parts, the ordinary parts. The particular shame of having believed him when he told her she was unstable. The slow accumulating erosion of having been inside that belief for so long that it had started to feel like her own thought rather than his. She lay in the dark for an hour. Then she got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened the laptop she'd bought with the first reimbursement check from the asset recovery process. And she worked. Not on anything urgent. Just on the financial documentation she was continuing to compile for the federal case, threading connections, finding the buried pathways, doing the work that had always been the truest version of herself, the one Wesley had tried to convince her she didn't need. She worked until 5, and then she slept. And in the morning she called her friend Keisha, who had been one of the first connections Wesley had steered her away from, and she said, I owe you an explanation. Keisha said, You owe me coffee. The explanation can wait until the coffee's in front of us. They met that afternoon. The coffee took 2 hours. There were other calls, other coffees. The work of rebuilding a social landscape that had been dismantled by a process so gradual she hadn't seen it happening was slow and occasionally awkward and required her to say things she'd spent 2 years being trained not to say.
Things like, I made a mistake and I should have called and I don't know yet, but I'm figuring it out. She was not good at all of it. She was better at some of it than she'd expected. The forensic precision that had always been her professional strength turned out to be useful in personal inventory too. The ability to look at what was actually there, rather than the preferred version of it. Wesley's case moved through the federal system with the speed that major financial crimes prosecuted by three-letter agencies sometimes achieve when the evidence is comprehensive, and the defendant's legal architecture has been undermined at its foundation. His attorneys were good, expensive and prepared, and not without creativity. But Imani had spent 4 hours in Jiwoo's office reconstructing the exact financial structure, and she had given the federal investigators a map that was detailed enough that the creative lawyering had very little unexplored territory to work with. He was convicted on 11 counts. The sentencing hearing was in September, 8 months after the harbor. Imani attended. She sat in the courtroom in a gray blazer and looked at Wesley Carrington across 60 feet of federal courtroom and watched him receive 23 years from a federal judge who read the statement about the domestic abuse documentation with the specific controlled quality of someone managing a precise and categorical fury. Wesley looked at her once during the hearing, just once, near the end, before the guards moved him out. She held his gaze. She didn't look away, and she didn't look satisfied because she didn't feel satisfied. Satisfaction would have required the 2 years to be undone, and they weren't going to be. And she had made her peace with the fact that justice and restoration were different things, and you could have one without the other. What she felt was finished. That was enough. The assets recovered through the judicial process, the $40 million and the additional capital seized from connected accounts that the federal case uncovered in its broader sweep, were distributed through a legal framework that Imani had spent 3 months helping to construct, working with 2 federal investigators and a nonprofit legal organization that specialized in financial crimes against individuals. A portion went to restitution for other identifiable victims of the Orlov Syndicate's financial operations in the United States. A larger portion was redirected, through a court-approved foundation, toward programs that assisted domestic abuse survivors in rebuilding financial independence. The money that had been used to cage people helped, in its new form, to free them. Imani was not the director of that foundation. She was an architect of its structure and an early advisor to its board, and then she stepped back because she had a career to rebuild, and stepping back from things that didn't need her anymore was one of the skills she was actively developing. She was hired at a federal financial crimes unit in March, not as a consultant, as staff, with a specific remit around offshore account architecture and identity-based financial fraud. The hiring process had been complicated by the obvious complications and then simplified by the volume and quality of the work she'd produced for the Wesley prosecution, which had been reviewed by 3 senior investigators who had each used the word exceptional in their assessments. She started on a Monday in March. She wore the gray blazer. She worked. Desmond's involvement with Jiwoo's legitimate business operations was something she learned about gradually rather than all at once, which was probably the right way to learn about it. Jiwoo's organization had, as part of its sustained effort to build the legitimate infrastructure that insulated the rest, several businesses in the city that were completely above board: a logistics company, 2 auto repair and maintenance facilities, a warehousing operation connected to the port. Desmond had begun doing contract mechanical work for one of the auto facilities 4 months after the harbor. By summer, he was managing the maintenance operations for 2 of the facilities, with a salary that he told Imani about with the specific sheepishness of a man who had expected to feel more conflicted about it than he actually did. "The cars need servicing," he said. "I service cars. The man signs my check and I don't ask him what else he does." "You don't need to explain it to me," she said. "I want to explain it to you." "I know." She looked at him. "Korean machinery. Is it easier or harder than American?" He considered this seriously. "Easier to read," he said, "but less forgiving when you get it wrong." "That sounds right," she said. Jiwoo called her twice in the weeks after the harbor. Not to check on her. Or not only that. The calls had a specific practical content. Updates on the federal cooperation arrangements, information about what the investigation had pulled from the Orlov network that had implications for the documentary record she was building. It was useful, which meant the calls were useful, which meant she took them without having to decide how to categorize them. They had dinner in April.
not at his estate. At a restaurant she had chosen, in a neighborhood she had lived in before Wesley, with lighting that was normal and a noise level that was human and a menu that had no performance of exclusivity about it. She was early by 4 minutes because she had always been early to things, and he arrived exactly on time, which she was beginning to understand was his version of consideration. Not early, which would have been waiting for her, but present at the agreed moment, which left the arrival to her. They ate and they talked, and the conversation had the quality of two people who had been through something together and were now finding out what they were without the emergency. It was not seamless. There were places where the edges showed, where she said something and he went quiet in a way that communicated something she'd have to learn to read properly, or where he was direct about something and she felt the old reflex, the conditioned instinct to soften herself in response to directness, and she let herself feel the reflex and then let it go. He noticed when she let it go. She could tell. "You're different," he said. "From what?" "From the hospital room, in the estate." She thought about that. "I think I'm less managed," she said. "In the estate I was still performing being okay. Tonight I'm actually okay. It's a different thing." He looked at her steadily. "It is," he said. She met his eyes. "How much of what you do is going to be a problem?" she said. Not confrontationally, practically, the way she approached everything that needed real examination. He was quiet for a moment. "Some of it always will be," he said. "I'm not going to tell you otherwise." "And the parts that aren't?" "Those I'm making more of," he said. "Have been, for a long time. This is an accelerated version of that process." She held his gaze. "I'm not a project." "No," he said. "You're a reason." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 43rd floor penthouse and the marble floor and the 3% battery and the way she'd typed a wrong digit in the dark with shaking hands. She thought about the 10-year-old boy who had called the police and had his arm broken for it, and who had sat in a conference room at midnight 26 years later and read 7 words from a stranger and stood up. She thought about what it meant that the worst night of her life had been answered, at the level of 1 digit in a phone number, by the right response. "I'm not going to be careful about this," she said, "in the sense of keeping it at a distance in case it goes wrong. I've been careful about things in ways that didn't protect me, and I've been reckless about things in ways that did. I'm going to be honest about this instead. If that works for you." "Yes," he said. It was simple and complete the way his agreements were simple and complete. No performance of enthusiasm, no overcommitment, just yes, and the steadiness behind it. She nodded. They had dessert. It was a small thing, and it mattered in the way small things matter after large ones. Proof that ordinary life was still running, still available, still capable of containing 2 people having coffee and a piece of something sweet at a table they'd chosen themselves. 6 months later, she was on Jeju Island. She had come for a conference, an international financial crime symposium at which she had been invited to present the documentary methodology behind the Wesley prosecution, the specific forensic architecture that had made the offshore account contestation successful under the treaty framework. She had accepted because the work was good, and the invitation was earned, and she was done declining things that were hers. Jiwoo had a property on the island. His family had maintained it for 2 generations, a quiet house on a hillside above the water. Not large, not performing its own significance. He had not suggested she stay there. He had mentioned at dinner in November that the property existed. The suggestion, when it eventually materialized, came from her, which was the version she needed it to be. She stayed for the conference. Then she stayed for 3 days afterward. The island in late summer was the opposite of a Chicago January harbor in almost every measurable way. Warm, unhurried, with the specific quality of air that comes from being surrounded by ocean on all sides, salt and warmth, and the constant low presence of wind that had nowhere urgent to be. She worked in the mornings. Old habits. She sat on the house's open terrace with her laptop and a coffee and the sun coming up over the water, and she worked on the next case, a different offshore structure, a different set of people who had used financial complexity to make their crimes invisible. The work was good. It had always been good, and Wesley's 2 years of convincing her otherwise had not changed that, had only delayed it. In the afternoons, she walked. She walked the coastal paths that ran along the island's edge, not fast, not with a destination,
just with the sustained physical presence in her body that she'd been rebuilding since January. Her ribs had been fully healed for 4 months. She breathed without managing it now. Full breaths, deep ones, the kind that filled her completely. One evening, Ji Woo came out to the terrace where she'd been sitting since the sun started going down, watching the light change over the water. The way light over water changed on islands. Slowly, then all at once. He sat down beside her. He had something in his hand. He held it out. She looked at it. Her phone. The one from January. She recognized the case first, the specific crack across the lower left corner from when it had hit the penthouse floor, and then the dead screen, dark and permanent. "You kept it," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at it. "Because it felt like something I shouldn't throw away." She took it from him. It was lighter than she remembered. Dead technology always was. The weight of the charge somehow significant in a way you didn't notice until it was gone. She turned it over in her hands, one wrong digit. She had been lying on a marble floor in the dark, trying not to breathe too deeply, certain that the small choices available to her were the only choices she would ever get, and she had mistyped a number. That was the whole machinery of it, a transposed 7 and a 9. The word for what had followed was not luck exactly. Luck implied passivity, implied that the good thing had simply happened to her. What had actually happened was that a wrong number had landed in front of a man who had not been required to act and had acted anyway, and that a woman who had spent 2 years being told she was powerless had taken the power that was still in her, fractured and diminished and operating on 3% battery, and used it with extraordinary precision at every moment it mattered. Both of those things. Not one. Both. "I don't love you because you saved me," she said. He looked at her. "I mean that," she said. "I know what that sounds like, but I mean the specific thing. I don't love you because you came through the door. I love you because after I learned that I could come through my own doors, you let me. You never—" She stopped, found the right shape for it. "Wesley spent 2 years deciding what I was allowed to be. You never decided that. Even in the beginning, when you were keeping me in your estate and managing the situation, you gave me the files, you gave me the work, you gave me the tools, and you stepped back." Jiwoo was watching her with the complete attention that was, she'd come to understand, his primary language. He did not fill silences to manage them. He waited inside them. "That's not a small thing," she said. "In my particular history, that's not a small thing at all." "No," he said. "I know it isn't." She looked at the phone in her hands. "I texted the wrong number," she said, "and you read it the right way." He reached over and his hand covered hers, over the dead phone, both their hands around the cracked case and the dark screen and everything that had been set in motion by one wrong digit on a January night in a locked penthouse on the 43rd floor. "One wrong number changed everything," he said. "It did," she said. They sat there on the terrace as the sun went the rest of the way down over the water, and the sky did what island skies do at the end of the day, deepened through colors that didn't have names in any practical language, moving from the orange gold of late afternoon through a long wash of rose and then into the blue dark that came before the stars. The water was vast and calm below the hillside. The wind was warm. Imani Caldwell sat in the dark with the man who had crossed Chicago for a stranger, and she was not frightened, and she was not managed, and she was not the woman on the penthouse floor. She was also that woman, would always be that woman, the woman who had lain on the cold marble and found the phone and typed with shaking hands because she had not stopped fighting, even when fighting meant only one text message with 3% battery left. She was that woman and this woman simultaneously. The cage had not been destroyed. She had walked out of it carrying what she'd built inside it, every skill, every precision, every hard-earned understanding of how systems worked and how people hid inside them, and how the truth could be found if you followed the numbers far enough back. She had carried all of it out. And here, on a hillside above the sea, with the stars beginning their slow appearance above the water, she put the dead phone down on the table between them and left it there. Not as a symbol, not performing the release of it, just setting it down because her hands were free and there were other things to do with them, and the past was not a weight she was required to carry forever. She looked at the water, she breathed in, she breathed out, full and deep and unmanaged. The night opened around her and she